The Greatest Sin in the Bible, an Adventist Mission in the 21st Century, by Kim Papaioannou. Kim Papaioannou, who holds a doctoral degree, pastors in Cyprus. Which is the greatest sin committed by a person in the Bible? No, I am not thinking about the unpardonable sin. My mind immediately goes to the primeval rebellion of Lucifer against God, or to Adam and Eve deliberately eating the forbidden fruit. What about the fall? Could that be Judas's betrayal of Jesus? The crucifixion of Jesus? David's sin against Bathsheba and Uriah? Recently, my thoughts have been drawn to another candidate, Jeroboam. Who? You might wonder. Neither Jeroboam nor his sin appears prominently in theological discussions. Yet, the Bible mentions it more than 30 times, more than any other sin I can think of recorded by inspiration. It is called a quote-unquote great sin. What was Jeroboam's sin? And what are its implications for Adventist theology and mission in the 21st century? Jeroboam and his sin. After Solomon's death, Israel split into two kingdoms, Judah in the south, comprising the tribes of Judah and Benjamin, with Jerusalem as its capital, and descendants of David on the throne. Israel in the north included the remaining tribes, with its eventual capital in Samaria, and was ruled by kings not from the line of David. Jeroboam, who reigned around 931 to 910 BC, was the first king of the northern kingdom of Israel. Jeroboam built two temples as alternatives to the temple in Jerusalem, in Bethel and Dan. He made and installed a golden calf in each temple and declared, quote, "Behold your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." End quote. We need to clarify some facts. First, worshiping God in the form of a calf was a direct breach of the second commandment. It constituted idolatry. Second, peoples of the ancient Near East commonly used calves and bulls to depict deities. The similarity to the golden calf incident at Sinai is also obvious, with Jeroboam using nearly identical words to introduce the images. To Jeroboam's credit, however, while the Sinai sin degenerated into sexual immorality, it does not seem that Jeroboam's did. Third, it is not clear if Jeroboam's calves implied polytheism, as the plural quote-unquote gods, Elohim, seems to suggest, or whether the two calves were both representations of Jehovah, since the plural Elohim most commonly references the one true God. Fourth, Jeroboam endeavored to replicate the Jerusalem temple worship. He instituted a priesthood, though not of the line of Levi, quote, appointed a feast like the feast that was in Judah, end quote, but on a different date, and offered animal sacrifices. Fifth, the sin of Jeroboam paved the way for worse idolatry later, especially during the reign of Ahab. But even then, Jeroboam's sin remained the defining sin of Israel. Sixth, Jeroboam's sin led the people into idolatry that eventually destroyed the nation. While some did not follow his sin, most prominent of which were the prophets Elijah and Elisha, most of the Israelites accepted Jeroboam's initiatives, Jeroboam's motives, self-preservation, and convenience. Jeroboam appears to have believed in God. So why did he make the calves and build the two alternative temples? First, he feared that he would lose the allegiance of his subjects if they habitually went to Jerusalem to worship God. Second, it would have been very inconvenient for him to worship in the temple in Jerusalem because the city was now the capital of a rival country with which he did not have cordial relations. Convenience and self-preservation, then, seemed to be his motives. Why was Jeroboam's sin great? So far, we have painted a picture of a king who, to maintain his kingdom, establishes an alternative worship. While it certainly constituted a serious breach of divine law, it would hardly seem to qualify as the greatest sin in the Bible, especially when compared to things other Bible characters did. What then made Jeroboam's sin so great? The answer is in the words "who made Israel to sin," a phrase that appears 20 times in relation to Jeroboam's sin. The impact of many grievous sins is limited in time and space to those immediately involved. By contrast, Jeroboam made the breach of the second commandment national policy and clothed it with a sense of respectability by imitating the worship of the Jerusalem temple. It was not a sin he alone committed, or even one that a few other people committed. He led a whole nation into sin, and it was not a one-time incident. It had a lasting impact, leading the nation into prolonged apostasy. To illustrate the point, we can compare Jeroboam's sin with the golden calf incident at Sinai. There, the people, desiring to return to the gods of Egypt, coerced Aaron into making a calf and began worship that degenerated into sexual immorality. Moses intervened forcefully. The perpetrators were punished. Israel repented. God offered forgiveness, and the incident came to an end. With the two calves of Jeroboam, the initiative came not from a rowdy crowd, but from an apparently God-fearing king who ordained not a wild party disguised as worship, but organized worship of Jehovah, modeled on that of the Jerusalem temple. It seemed to be so close to the real worship that it was difficult to discern between the genuine and the fake. The heinousness of the Sinai sin was checked and repented of quickly. Jeroboam's sin affected Israel for a much longer period. Respectable-looking sins can be more deadly than heinous ones. We thus conclude that the great sin of Jeroboam was not that he broke the second commandment. Many others did so both before and after him. It was rather that the breach was done in such a way that it became institutionalized. They did not depart. Jeroboam died around 910 BC. Another 18 kings reigned from his death to the end of the kingdom of Israel. None departed from his path. Scripture specifically states that 16 continued Jeroboam's activities, even Zimri, who reigned only 7 days. The 16 also include Jehu, the only king of the northern kingdom whom the biblical record otherwise describes in a somewhat positive light. Only of Shallum and Hoshea do the biblical records not specifically state that they followed in Jeroboam's footsteps. Of the two, Shallum reigned only a month. Hoshea seems to have had better intentions, but still did not remove the two calves. Scripture employs different phrases to describe the attitudes of the various kings, some suggesting willing compliance, such as, quote, walked in, end quote, or, quote unquote, followed, and other implying compliance like, quote unquote, did not turn, or, quote unquote, did not depart. 2 Kings 13:6 indicates that what applied to the kings also applied to the people. The sin of Jeroboam led to the eventual destruction of the northern kingdom, with the fall of Samaria in 722 BC. Assyria took the northern tribes captive. Accustomed to worshiping images, they intermarried and assimilated with the inhabitants of their new homes. History repeated. History tends to repeat itself, while not always in identical ways, in similar ones. A similar situation to Jeroboam's developed again centuries later in the Christian church, and this time it involved not only the second commandment, but also the fourth. Images were popular among pagans for both decoration and worship. Slowly, they crept into Christian worship, especially from the 4th century onward, after Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity. Although initially accepted for didactic purposes, images soon became objects of worship. Many Christians opposed the trend, including the Byzantine Emperor Leo III, who legislated against the practice, and the Synod of Hieria, but the Seventh Ecumenical Council around 787 AD approved the veneration of icons. What had begun as a leftover aspect of paganism was granted the official approval of an ecumenical council. A similar development took place regarding the fourth commandment. Sunday was a special day in some sun-worshipping religions. Sunday worship first seems to have been introduced into the Christian church in the 2nd century in Rome as an attempt by Christians to distance themselves from Judaism, which was under extreme pressure from the Roman authorities due to repeated Jewish revolts. 2 centuries later, Emperor Constantine made Sunday a rest day by civil law in AD 321, and the Council of Laodicea in AD 364 followed suit and formally made Sunday a Christian holy day. As such, the Council of Laodicea and the Seventh Ecumenical Council institutionalized the breach of the second and fourth commandments, cloaking them with a robe of acceptability, unwittingly replicating what Jeroboam had done many centuries earlier. Self-preservation and convenience seem to have similarly played a major role. Constantine ruled an empire divided between Christians and pagans. The adoption of Sunday and, later, the worship of images helped bridge the gap between the two groups. The single biggest event in Christian history in modern times was the Protestant Reformation. The Reformers not only upheld the great doctrine of justification by faith, but also signaled a clear break from the worship of images. Thanks to their great legacy, today about 1 billion Protestant Christians worship God in harmony with the second commandment. But for our Catholic and Eastern Orthodox brothers, numbering close to 2.5 billion, the worship of images and other objects remains. The news is worse when it comes to the fourth commandment. While Sabbatarian individuals and groups have existed throughout history, from the Middle Ages onward, they have been a minuscule minority. The Seventh-day Adventist Church is the largest Protestant Sabbatarian community and numbers more than 23 million, a respectable number, but still very small compared to the more than 3 billion Christians. The call to return to obedience to the fourth commandment must be heard louder than ever. Implications for Adventist mission. We have seen how Jeroboam institutionalized the breach of the second commandment until it became the defining sin of the northern kingdom that eventually led to its demise. Christian history also reveals how church councils institutionalized the breach of both the second and fourth commandments. And while the Protestant Reformation has done a lot to undo the former, the breach of the fourth continues unabated. The Seventh-day Adventist Church has made Sabbath observance a focus of its theology and practice, as well as its mission, and the result is very encouraging. Every year, more than 1 million persons are baptized into the Adventist Church, in large part because they become convinced of the ongoing validity of the biblical Sabbath. But there always exists the danger of fatigue. Is the Sabbath, or the second commandment for that matter, so important in the bigger picture after all? Someone might wonder. The 10 tribes of the northern kingdom continued to be God's people, even as they walked in the ways of Jeroboam. But they followed a dangerous path that eventually led to their demise. Out of love for his people, God sent them great prophets, such as Elijah and Elisha, to call them back to correct worship. It seems that the story of Jeroboam and the subsequent fall of the northern kingdom must serve as a reminder to never waver. Ours is a prophetic ministry to call fellow Christians to return to the biblical model of worship and respect for all God's commandments, including the second and the fourth. For bibliographical and biblical references on this article, and for much more content for pastors and church leaders, please visit ministrymagazine.org.